also the first one ever actually to be online. And I hope it works out fine. As somebody said, Teams meetings are a bit like seances of the past. It's a bit like, hello, Elisa, can you hear us? We cannot see you. Are you there? Make a noise when you're there. So I hope actually that it works out fine this evening and that there are no technical glitches. As regards me, most of you know me already. I'm Dr. Peter Lehr. I'm a senior lecturer here. And I'm here for 16 years, the second most ancient one of the staff, most ancient one as regards years of service, not an age, of course, is our Gillian Brunton, who you also know very well. I have the honor today to be the chair of the proceedings. Normally that would be something that our director, Tim Wilson, does. But since it's his book launch, the honor is mine today. But there's no need to tell at length anything about myself. It's all about Tim today. And as I can see from the list of attendees, I think all of you know Tim fairly well. So there is no need to go to the basics. Yes, Tim is a Cambridge boy by origin. He is a historian by trade, so to speak, and he is the director of the CSTPV. He is working on areas that us Germans normally ignore. That's the 20s, 1920s, 1930s, written a book about that. And now he has published a new one, Killing Strangers. So there's not much to say about him. However, there was coincidentally an interview with him in our weekly online magazine, The Loop, that's the university's one. And there are some tidbits of things that you probably have never known about him, and you're rearing to know now. For example, what attracted him to St. Andrews. And he said to that, if you're going to think about a subject like terrorism, it helps to be on the coast. The sea puts the horrors in perspective somehow. Now, well, I'm a specialist on piracy, on maritime terrorism, so I would beg to differ to a certain extent. The coast can be quite a dangerous place, but not arguably the coast of St. Andrews. The second one I found even more interesting. Tell us something that might surprise you, surprise us about you. And he said to that, a few years back, I built an entire scale model of the Battle of Waterloo. I pretended it was for my son, but really it was just something I had always wanted to do. That's really sad, isn't it? Well, no, actually, I also had to build a model of Waterloo a couple of years ago. But that goes back to my youth. But it seems to be that both of us, especially Tim, have a certain kind of obsession with the killing of strangers in a certain way of speaking. Of course, I should hasten to add, only in a very theoretical perspective. And that's basically what we are talking about today, about his book, Killing Strangers. And in order to tell you a little bit more about the proceedings, just one or two sentences more, actually I had in mind first a kind of a fireside talk where I'm asking lots of questions and Tim answers a lot of them. But the problem was that it might actually deteriorate into kind of an Ersatzweiber. Like on the top of page 99, you said something like that, and that would be a kind of embarrassing. So I think we simply stick to the normal format where Tim will talk for about 30 minutes about his book. And especially I asked him to do that about the procedure and the travails of writing a book, so that especially our PhDs know that a book is nothing that simply falls from the heaven, but needs to be fought for. And then basically after that, we have a couple of questions and answers and see how that goes. With that, with these warm words, I think over to you, Tim. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm sorry if you're all getting a very strange kind of nightclub effect from my shirt and the camera. That wasn't intentional or planned, although perhaps I should have gone for it as a device to distract you all from Peter outing my geeky modelling past that I was unwise enough to let slip to the loop. But thank you, Peter, for those very warm words of welcome. And thank you to all for giving up a slab of your infinitely precious Thursday evening to hear a little bit about my book. I will talk very briefly about its sort of genesis a little bit, or the process of it, and then perhaps move on to what I hope some of the value of it is, and then we can have a question and answer session where you can all tell me that I'm wrong, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion about it. I mean, as Peter says, I am very much an armchair murderer when it comes to writing about killing strangers. But the entire process of writing can make one fairly murderous. I had a cat while I was writing this, whom I nearly strangled because it was a very postmodernist cat who believed that the concepts of being inside and being outside were mere social constructions that could be endlessly subverted. And possibly the book would have been finished in half the time if this cat had taken a more empiricist view of what constituted being in and out. It could just make its bloody mind up as to where it wanted to be. Writing can be stressful. It can be hard work. It can also be, of course, enormously fulfilling. But when it isn't going well, then the entire family suffers with you. In my case, but I'm very grateful to my 11-year-old daughter Roz, who took a very keen interest in the process, and to the extent of wanting to design a book jacket and cover and suggesting the words on the back cover. As you can see, there's a whole slab of text from Oxford University Press, and she thought it should be much more punchy, much more concise. It should just say, "Once upon a time, there were some very angry people. Find out what happened inside." And I think that might have been a much better sort of text to have had on the back cover. But I think what she did was sort of raise for me some of the sort of perceptions out there of what we think causes terrorism and some of its particularly horrific qualities, and this kind of sense that's driven by rage and anger and irrationality, which it may well be to some degree, but I think there is more to say on that. And I think while I'm in that vein, it's worth acknowledging the origins of this book, which is very much a CSTPV book. In fact, it really goes back to a few years when Peter and I used to teach the core module on terrorism studies. And I'm sure Peter won't contradict me when I say that there was a period when I introduced what I think has been the most disastrous assessment that I've ever had the honor in my teaching career to attempt. And that was an essay question that I used to put to our master's students. And if you are part of this year's master's cohort, don't worry, it's been removed from the curriculum. I was quite proud of it. I thought it was kind of simple and elegant. And the wording was simply, what, if anything, is modern about terrorism? Now, I think it's fair to say, as I say, I'm sure Peter would agree, it was a turkey. It was a question that really never flew. It was an absolute disaster, and sort of unsatisfactory attempts to answer it sort of piled up in deep drifts, and really never did get a good answer to it. And the problems with that are not, as you might think, defining conceptual, notoriously conceptually slippery areas like, terrorism and what is terrorism. By the time Peter had trained them, our students were well up to speed on that and how one might approach that. The definitional quagmire, or the conceptual sort of Bermuda Triangle into which they all disappeared without trace, was the concept of modern and modernity. And almost invariably, it didn't really matter how many hints or cues or steers I thought I'd given in previous lectures. The students, quite understandably, tended to take the word modern as a synonym for recent. And of course, the question, what is recent about terrorism, is fairly pointless, as some of them were kind enough or honest enough to sort of indicate in their answers. What I was trying to do, deeply ambitiously and unsatisfactorily, was to encourage a much longer sort of quasi-sociological / historical view, understanding modernity as something that has occurred and developed. And as I say, defining terrorism is easy beside it. But, very broadly, we're talking about a series of processes that did start in what we often call, the Western world, parts of the global North, Western Europe, the USA, so forth, but which have spread throughout the globe, albeit with very different iterations and developments. But broadly, we're talking about a transformation from predominantly tradition-bound, predominantly agrarian, predominantly rural subsistence economies and societies to those that are industrial, urban, networked, mobile. So it's a very expansive concept of what modernity is or can be. And I wanted to sort of think about, what is the relationship of political violence to those processes? Now, one of the prerogatives and privileges of being a lecturer is you get to ask the questions you really wouldn't want to have to answer much yourself. But this was one occasion where I thought, as the unsatisfactory essays piled up, I thought I was sort of honor bound and duty bound to sort of really try and answer my own questions. So this, in a sense, you can see this book, if you like, as a sort of history of terrorism that dare not speak the name. I sort of skirt around the question of what is terrorism for reasons we can get into in the question and answer session. But in a sense, it is trying to answer that question. What, if anything, is modern about the violence that we often call terrorism? So that's the kind of genesis of it, really. All the books we write to some extent are autobiography. They're, often I think one starts out thinking, I'd like to read a book about that. And I've got to bloody write it if I'm going to read a book about it, because it's obviously too niche for anyone else to pick up. But it was trying, through a very granular approach. I tried to sidestep the question of what is terrorism in any sort of very precisely defined way, although I'm open to the concept of terroristic violence, the idea that there is a type of political violence that targets some victims indirectly to spread a message elsewhere. But I shied away from being too pinned down on definitions. It didn't seem to me a particularly fruitful way forward to come up with a strict definition of terrorism and then try and reverse engineer a genealogy, a sort of, backstory for the sake of it. Instead, what I tried to do was something more granular. I tried to shift the focus from propaganda to deeds, so to speak, and to look at violent actions, and to look at how violent actions changed in the areas of the world I've mentioned, Western Europe, the USA, over 250 years, really, since the French Revolution. And, you may think that's a crazily ambitious thing to do. There were many times during the writing of it when I came to think it was a crazily ambitious thing to do. I think, as I say, writing can be a lonely journey, and one often sort of seesaws a little bit between being excited about it and sort of angst and self-doubt. And I'm not saying that, self-doubt is a good thing from a mental health point of view, but from an academic point of view, it's often a form of quality control. We sort of want, we hope, or hope that make our work as good as we can, and we worry that it isn't. As a historian, I sort of worried that I was drifting off into antiquarianism. Antiquarianism is what all historians fear. It's the kind of basically the idea that you just pile up a load of boring old stuff because it's old, and that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of try and explain how we got to the world that we're in from a very different past. And really, the general point here is that the world we're in is extremely strange. Seen in a long-term historical perspective, the types of political violence that we study here at CSTPV and in the school as well are often pretty extraordinary, actually. The stunning impersonality of so much contemporary violence, the people whom you've never met can threaten you and perhaps blow you to bits or whatever. And the fact that we, at some level, internalize that and take that for granted. You cannot catch a flight. You cannot travel on the London Underground or a metro or a subway in any major city in the world and not be reminded through security notices that this could happen repeatedly, repetitively. It's put in your mind that this is a possibility. And yet, if we turn the clock right back, there's a rather nice quote I like from the 1790s, an official in the Rhone Valley of southern France writing to his superiors in Nîmes. And this minor government official was trying to get his village off the hook. They'd been accused of being involved in various murders to do with the turmoil of the French Revolution. And he wanted to explain to his regional, provincial superior, it wasn't anything to do with us. It couldn't have been anything to do with us because we didn't know these people. And just that giveaway sentence contains essentially an entire theory of how violence in that time and place worked. You didn't kill people you didn't know. There was always a backstory. There was always prior relationships and interconnections. And what seems so jarring is when we look at the sort of terroristic attacks around the world today, is the fact that element is missing. Much of this violence has, in the words of Joseph Conrad, a quality of blood-stained inanity. There's something just sort of enormously impersonally callous and jaw-droppingly indifferent about it. It may be driven by rage and hate and other things, but I think the quality of indifference is what is so an instrumentalism that, you know, strangers are just sort of chewed up and spat out and cashed in as meat for free publicity, so to speak. That struck me as odd. I mean, it still strikes me as odd, and yet somehow that question seems rarely asked. It also struck me as connected with wider and deeper social and economic processes. You know, very often in studying terrorism, we're very keen to establish clear definitions. And yet, if we look at a spree killing and a kind of marauding firearms terrorist attack, are they not basically the same act, albeit with different motivations and intentions? And perhaps, even though I try to keep the emphasis on the political violence, perhaps some acknowledgement of family resemblances, so to speak, family resemblances to other types of impersonal violence, such as serial killing, such as spree killing, that also do seem relatively specific to a certain type of late modern society, might be fruitful. And so with those kind of ideas in mind, I've really sort of tried to draw out perhaps three main areas or themes where perhaps something can, this kind of approach, looking back over 250 years, can perhaps show us something we might not otherwise think about in the same kind of way. I think the first thing to kind of stress is the kind of societies that I've been looking at. The thing that comes through in any campaign against the state of terrorist violence or political violence or whatever we want to call it is the sheer asymmetry of coercive capacity on each side. You know, putting it bluntly, modern states have a reach and a hold over your lives that your ancestors could never have dreamt of. And there's, you know, there may, I don't know whether Fife Council puts a camera in your wheelie bin to see whether you kind of recycle properly or not. But, you know, that kind of reach and control is extraordinary. You know, if you come to St Andrews or whatever with a visa to study, you'll know just how arduous it can be to negotiate those processes. You know, the Roman Empire didn't have a police force. You know, even the most coercive and well-run kind of units of the ancient world that we think of, you know, really didn't have that kind of fine-grained control over their citizens and subjects that we take entirely for granted. And, you know, about 20 years ago, there was Susan Strange's work and that sort of thing. There was a kind of very fashionable trend in sociology and a lot of political science to see the modern state as essentially being hollowed out by processes of globalization. It was becoming weaker and weaker as the forces of late capitalism, capital flows, basically hollowed it out from within, and governments and states were it was claimed, becoming weaker and weaker. Well, you know, there are changes there, and we can discuss them maybe in question and answer session. But, you know, I think if one needed an argument for the coercive power of modern states, then 2020 is it. You know, the power of lockdown, the power of states to actually control our lives, you know, is demonstrated, I think, pretty forcefully and unambiguously. So I think, you know, I would hammer home this point about the actual coercive power and resilience and strength of modern states in the areas of the world I'm looking at is, you know, really historically quite extraordinary. And if one thinks of processes of unrest and revolution and coups and so forth, you know, they basically seem to have faded away. It is true, I will look very foolish if the American election goes horribly wrong. I mean, obviously that would be a moral disaster, and I hope it doesn't happen because it, you know, some sort of major civil unrest or sort of civil war, as some of the wilder spirits are prophesying, would, you know, be a moral disaster. But it would also be kind of on a very micro solipsistic level, kind of disappointing for me in terms of, you know, in the book, I sort of tend to emphasize the strength of modern states and saying, you know, a lot of the turbulence we're seeing is relatively superficial in many ways. But there's a lot of it. And that brings me on to my kind of second point, which is the role of technology in molding the shape and direction and dynamics of political violence. You know, very often when one kind of reads histories of terrorism, there's kind of sense in which, well, you know, hundreds of years ago, then assassins used to use daggers and now they use bombs. And, you know, that's just a kind of updating. Well, the miniaturization of explosives is something I talk about at great length and I think is a key theme. But, you know, I would defer to the wise words of recently left us, unfortunately, but our CSTPV comrade Gilbert Ramsey, who, you know, wrote very wisely in one of his recent works, quote, we forget that technology doesn't just help us get more of what we want, it changes what we want and how we understand our very existence. And I think, you know, one of the things that sort of struck me looking at the evolution of the sort of terroristic bombing campaign or hostage crisis or other tactics was the extent to which these could be understood as what in media studies I believe they call pseudo events. You know, a pseudo event doesn't mean it doesn't happen or isn't real. It just means it's an event that is staged for the sole purpose of being broadcast. You know, the ribbon cutting ceremony, the press conference, you know, these types of events exist before mass media and are predicated upon them. You know, they are dependent upon that, but they reflect a world in which from the sort of mid-late 19th century, it became increasingly obvious that influence and the ability to pull the tides of public opinion your way constituted a form of power. And I think if we see a lot of terroristic tactics in that light, then they appear as much more they appear as extreme examples of much more general trends rather than as something aberrational in their own right. In other words, you know, they belong to our society and our times and our civilization. They're not as strange as all that, even if they may be extreme and horrific. I think the third major theme that I really emerged in the writing of Killing Strangers, and I wasn't at all sure that I thought it through as much as I'd like to, but was the relationship of terrorism to war, the relationship, if you like, of small violence to big violence. You know, very often terrorism is kind of understood as a form of warfare. In Alex Schmidt's famous phrase, it's, you know, terrorist attacks are the peacetime equivalent of, you know, war, battlefield atrocities. The more I've thought about this, the less certain I am. You know, it seems to me that many of the histories of terrorism we have really just ignore the world wars altogether. You know, David Rappaport's 4 waves of rebel terrorism, the world wars are barely mentioned, which seems extraordinary. When I tried to look at the sort of what happens to techniques of political violence, I was struck by how much violence is left on the battlefield, how little relatively, there are exceptions, but relatively how little leakage after World War I and II there was from the battlefield into practices of bombing campaigns and so on and so forth. And when one thinks of the sheer number of people who are, you know, trained in what we would now call IEDs and planting mines, improvised devices, one shape and another, that kind of clear dividing line between war and peace, at least for the regions of the world that I've been looking at, you know, strikes me as really rather salient and really rather remarkable. And, you know, often the development of terrorism seems to come more from the commercial sector. You know, dynamite came from blasting from quarries and from railroad tunnels and that sort of thing. And it's sort of publicity values, how attacks are staged to get attention, seems to me to be much more to belong to the world of advertising and, as I say, commanding publicity than it does to more conventional military tactics, which, in the words of the sociologist Sinisa Milesevic, are, you know, war is not primarily a discourse; it's a material event. You know, the weight of material destruction matters. Okay, I have banged on for quite long enough. I hope it has given you something to respond to. I'm also aware that as director of a terrorism studies centre to say, well, I kind of set off to write a book about terrorism, but I sort of avoided using the word, or I don't avoid using the word, but I certainly don't try and get too bogged down in definitions. May seem a strange and contradictory stance to take, but I think really that the point of doing so was so much of the political science and sociology and on terrorism tries to isolate it as a phenomenon, tries conceptually to delineate it and say what is distinct about it. I think if we reverse the telescope and ask what it has in common with other facets and features of our society today, as well as asking where those facets have come from, we might learn something. Listening to people bang on online meetings is always tiring, so I'll shut up and leave it there. Over to you.
Well, thanks much, Tim. I think the applause of the audience is taken for granted. It's kind of weird, isn't it, nowadays in these Teams meetings, talking to a kind of a silent computer screen. But anyway, it's the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question. I have actually two in mind. The first you already know, I've asked you already on the floor. How on earth did you get away with keeping the title Killing Strangers? I know that my editors would have ruled it out immediately, muttering something like you will never find it in a Google search. The second one is I've said I'm not asking you about on top of page 99. You said something like, so I'll ask you instead on top of page 98. You said, in any case, serious writing is itself a declining skill. Overturning and burning cars may look dramatic enough on TV or latterly social media, but it is no substitute for the old technical skills of effective barricade building that depended upon close-knit inner city communities and so on and so forth. I find it quite interesting if you take a look at how much riots actually are portrayed in newspapers, how quickly they snap up headlines and all the stuff. The riot in Germany, in Hamburg, for example, 3 years ago. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that as well.
Thanks very much, Peter. On the question of titles, I often don't really feel very inspired about choosing titles, if I'm honest. And for once, I came up with something that I was relatively happy with. I suppose the nearest comparator was the extraordinary book by Elliot Layton, an anthropologist who became an expert on serial killers, called Hunting Humans. So I suppose there was a kind of broad parallel. I wasn't aware that it was also the title of a kind of heavy rock song by Marilyn Manson, but that may not hurt. The OUP marketing department did try and push back and wanted terrorism in the title, which, since the entire book sort of skirts around embracing the concept unequivocally. I just got a bit stroppy, actually. I just pushed back a bit, and luckily the editors sided with me. It also... Yeah, I mean, as I say, I don't tend to feel very inspired with titles, but I hoped it was eye-catching enough and also sort of basically summed up what I do think is mysterious. I think, any good homicide detective will tell you look for a prior relationship when someone gets murdered. And the idea of killing a total stranger is very odd. So I was lucky, I think, on that. On your kind question about my writing about barricades and rioting. So, I mean, for those of you who haven't waded through my less than limpid prose, there's a couple of chapters that sort of in a fairly narrative form try and trace the rise of what I call the society of hyper order, the society of essentially European societies, but America does follow a broadly similar trajectory eventually, or has its own iterations, but a society where the control of public behavior is extraordinarily meticulous and comes to be taken for granted. And that this really is new. 200 years ago, I cite some people like Lord Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary, and he'd make some unpopular decision and the mob would break his windows, and he would watch it happening and was, maybe it was stiff upper lip, but that's what you took for granted. If you're in public life, then occasionally this stuff would happen, and you didn't take it too seriously. What we've seen in the 19th century is the sort of rise and fall of a kind of urban insurrection tradition. When you look at the sort of pictures from 1848 or 1871 in Paris, the barricades can be 3 stories high. They are extraordinarily robust constructions. And when you have tight, close-knit working class communities that are well organized and have a tradition of resisting the state, who have the knowledge and the sort of templates of how you resist like that, then there is a brief period when, governments can really lose control. And, the point about barricades is not just that they are a military tactic, but that they slow down attacking troops. If they slow them down enough, you can talk to them. If you can talk to them, you can parley with them. If you can parley with them, maybe you can subvert their discipline. And if that sounds far-fetched and idealistic, it's exactly what happened in the Moscow coup in 1991. It's precisely what happened. So under the right circumstances, and a lot of moving parts have to sync, of course, but it can work. I think the sort of rioting you're seeing now, and certainly quite pronounced in the last 10 years, tends to be more episodic, tends to be more theatrical, more short-lived, even if it's repeated over quite long periods. And I think, that goes also, though, with greater restraint from the police side, on the state side. If one thinks back, if one looks at, say, even the Portland protests at the moment, I mean, I'm not excusing the behavior of the feds or the kind of, horrible stuff that one sees on Twitter and the abuses that happen. But, we're a long way away from Bloody Sunday, the British Army shooting 13 or killing 14 and all, actually, on the streets of Derry in 1971, which was, in my lifetime just, or even 10 years before that, where the prefecture of the Seine, the Paris police killed hundreds of Algerians. We literally do not know how many hundreds of Algerians got thrown in the Seine. So that kind of, there's a kind of theatricality to rioting that is actually by default predicated on the state showing some restraint and not just basically doing a Tiananmen Square.
Okay, Tim. Thanks, Tim. And with that, I think I'll open the floor. If you ask a question, please raise your hand first so that we can see that. And then when you're done with that, please lower it again. I can see that Kieran is already raring to ask a question. Please go ahead, Kieran.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks, Tim. I've been waiting for this moment for quite a few years now to turn the tables and grill you after you were the examiner on my PhD Viva. No, you were very kind at the time, and I must say, pour over Killing Strangers as I did, looking for something to nail you on, I wasn't able to find it. So my question comes from a genuine curiosity, and I'm glad that it follows Peter's question, because I think that it speaks to some of the issues that he raised. And I want to ask about killing with strangers and how that might have changed political violence over the period that you study. You reflect at one point in the book on the importance of kinship and group cohesion, and you talk about how the Symbionese Liberation Army didn't know each other before they descended on that same part of town in the East Bay area. And I contrasted that in my head with what I know about violence in Ireland and the importance of kinship and close relations there. People from the same neighbourhood, community, often from the same family. This is something that George Casimiris talks about in his study of the November 17 movement in Greece, about this kind of really durable, long-lasting terrorist organisation that at its core was a kind of family nucleus. Two brothers and their lovers, I think, at the core of that organisation, which is partly what he credits as giving this organisation its quality and its the trust and cohesion that's needed in order to sustain itself over time. And so that got me thinking about how terrorism might have changed in the last number of years, and I kind of contrasted that in my head with strangers flying halfway around the world to fight with internet acquaintances or people they've never met before, for a cause they might share, but still without those really strong, close kinship relations that are built up over and forged over a number of years. And I wondered whether that has any impact on the kind of success of terrorism or the decline in longevity of these groups. So I don't know. Just wonder what you thought the impact of that relation had been.
Thanks very much, Kieran. And no, I mean, you open up, and if I'm honest, and as sort of confessional streak. So I was lucky enough to have a year's research leave, which was an enormous luxury. And I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and I read. And in the summer of 2018, by the 1st of April 2019, I thought, I better bloody start writing, because I can't face my colleagues if I go back and I've produced nothing. But as I wrote it, these were some of these themes were beginning to come out, and I was thinking, goodness, this book should be 3 times as long to really do them justice. So I'm not sure I did do that justice at all. I sort of hinted it a bit, really. I hint at the way in which kind of terrorist cells seem to often devolve into a kind of group of 5 or 6 that seems to be about the same size of a kind of 19th century revolutionary conspiracy, the kind of Blancist movement in France and so on, Carbonari in Italy, or indeed the traditional bandit gangs of sort of more rural, primitive economies. I think it's a sort of obvious point that you're absolutely right, that there's as in crime, actually, there's a to live outside the law, you must be honest, as Bob Dylan said. I mean, that's a bit romantic, but you need to know who to trust. If you're not going to trust the official procedures, and it's not a surprise that, brothers are often involved in these things. You think of, Jesse James, Frank James, those kind of bandit gangs, who are you going to trust? And I think to that extent, I'm always I'm always deeply uncomfortable with sort of portraying Irish violence as somehow pre-modern or antiquated or left over, but there are ways in which some of those older patterns perhaps can be glimpsed in certain close-knit communities and the sort of cohesion it brings. You referenced the discussion of the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, and this is, I think, an extraordinary essay by the late Eric Hobsbawm. It comes in the second edition of Bandits, which he published in about 1969, I think, and then there's a 1981 edition, and there's about just a 10-page series of reflections on how do contemporary terrorist gangs or movements in 1981 resemble historical banditry. And really his point is, and I think it is broadly so, they don't very much. Traditional bandit gangs are often deeply misogynistic. It was about a bunch of young men. You didn't want to be tied down in relationships and the ties that would bring. And, bandit legend is often some false lover so there's kind of misogynistic tropes to that, but there's there clearly is, it's reflecting to some extent, I think, a reality that they tended to be kind of footloose men. The Symbionese Liberation Army is very different. It's just a bunch of strangers of really, comes out of the kind of protest movements of Berkeley and the kind of East Bay area and that sort of Californian radical subculture. What struck me is just the sheer vertiginous ambition. Hobsbawm makes the point that, even the great famous bandits, the Robin Hoods, were usually not known in their own lifetimes more than about 20 miles away or 30 miles away from where they operated. They were local heroes, literally. The Symbionese Liberation Army, who, for anyone who doesn't know them, they're a fascinating case study. They had this utterly clunky rallying slogan, "Death to the fascist insect," that preys upon the life of the people, which you'd have trouble fitting on any T-shirt. But they also had this, bizarrely just over-ambitious agenda that they were going to overthrow capitalism, liberate the masses. It's all extraordinarily unfocused, but the ambitions are just delusional. There was about, 5 of them or something, this tiny group. So, I think it is a different phenomenon. And again, it brings me back to moving away and pushing back against the idea of the exceptionalism of terrorism. Of course, to some extent, terrorism is exceptional, or it wouldn't get our attention, but it can be seen as a kind of extrapolation of much more embedded processes. And I think, Hobsbawm writing that 40 years ago now, really, that was on the move, that was on the way at a trajectory to an even more fragmented online world, as you said, of ISIS. And, I've often been struck by what comes out of intelligence agencies in recent years. They say, we've never been so stretched, we need more resources, we've never been so stretched. And I'm sure that's how they feel. But I used to kind of look at this and scratch my head and think, the kind of groups and rampages and horrible vehicle attacks and things we see are so amateur compared to what the provisional IRA would have done, or even the, RAF in West Germany or whatever back in the 70s, 80s. How can they possibly be struggling with this? But I think it is the volume. I think it's the rise of the many-to-many society and the networking and the kind of rhizoid possibilities of proliferation that are so difficult to manage from the state's point of view. Which, brings me back to the sort of question I slightly skirted in my introductory remarks, which is, having traced this kind of rise of the society of hyper-order and coercive capacity, is it unraveling with the internet society? Is it going backwards, or does it remain more open-ended? That was a very long and rambling answer, but thank you.
Thank you much. Okay, thank you. Patrick.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for the talk. Haven't read the book yet. It is still winging its way to me, so look forward to having a go at it soon. So maybe kind of preempted one of my questions, but I've got 2 very, very quick ones that you can kind of answer with yes or no, probably. On the knowing versus not knowing, do you think that it kind of comes out of what you're just saying? Is it enough to stereotypically know someone? Like, you target a group because you know bits and pieces about them, so they're not really strange, you have certain assumptions about them, versus kind of complete and utter kind of absence of idea. And then on the barricading and kind of history of riots and different types of violence, have we kind of moved away from seeing these tactics as kind of having any kind of success when you're saying the power of the state is just much larger than it ever has been? So have we stopped properly barricading because we know it won't work, and riots have kind of become more performative than kind of really heartfelt attempts to bring about change? Kind of has a change in that kind of violence occurred?
I wish I could restrict myself to yes/no answers. But to answer at a little greater length, I mean, I think on the knowing, not knowing, I think context matters. And I'm struck, certainly in terms of effects, I'm really been struck over the last 10 years since I joined CSTPV and began to think a lot more about international terrorism, which I'd never really done before, of how different it is to, say, the conflicts in Northern Ireland. I mean, the sheer, there is a sort of toxic intimacy to the sectarian violence. Even if you don't know the individual victim, you can often know from what side of the street they're walking on, what bus they take, what school uniform they're wearing. There's been plenty of those kind of instances where there's enough contextual clues for those in the know to identify. And the practice in Northern Irish anthropology of what they call telling, which is basically just how you work out when you meet someone in Northern Ireland, what they are, are they a Catholic or a Protestant? These kind of ascriptive identities that are hard to dodge or shake off. Something my English students at Oxford always used to find incredibly primitive, and I always used to try and pointing out to them that you do exactly the same with class, whether someone drops their H's or has tattoos, but they thought that was entirely normal, but, categorizing people by a different set of criteria was totally weird. And of course, it's a basic rule of politeness in those kind of divided societies that those skills so that you don't cause unnecessary offense. But in extreme cases, it's of course the prelude to murder and slaughter, and what struck me over 100 years at least is the ubiquity and the stability of how you tell. You put a gun to someone's head and ask them to recite a Hail Mary. I don't know whether it would work now in days of falling off attendance at mass, but certainly those are tests that come up in the 1920s troubles in Belfast and in the 1970s, 80s, even early 90s troubles. So the extraordinarily long-term repetitions of exactly the same diagnostic tests, if you like, to make sure that you get, quote unquote, the right type of victim. That seems to me really rather different from the sort of the bomb at the airport that can just take out anyone, and that sort of quality of what the English common law calls universal malice is, really quite bewildering. And I guess even then you can see, Al Qaeda, or whoever it is, tackling some Western interest, but it's pretty broad brush who they catch up in that. In terms of the discussion of public order and rioting, and I say it is a book that attempts to kind of look broadly at political violence, not just the stuff we classically think of as terrorism, but to situate it in a wider landscape. There I try to be, I'm pretty agnostic actually. I mean, in a sense, the book ends on a very, very open-ended note. So, my point about the sort of the society of hyper order is, yes, the state has enormous coercive control and enormous micro control over people's lives and public order. But conversely, precisely because of that, when disruption does occur, it can resonate enormously widely, precisely because our expectations are so high. I was really struck by some of the diaries from June 1940 as the Nazis close on Paris, and people are in their diaries are they're looking at the fountains still playing, or watering the grass in the Tuileries Gardens, and they're kind of, well, things can't be that bad if they're still watering the grass, and they're kind of desperate for this kind of routine and order to continue, and any infraction of it seems enormously disturbing. So, we're more febrile, and the sheer instability of politics and the sheer rampant individualism that seems to be a kind of feature, particularly of all political extremes, particularly the far right, is causing a lot more low-level mayhem, and it's hard to see that dying out. So I don't dismiss it. I just don't think the old-style kind of coups, revolutions, collapses into civil war are as likely as they are. But, we're in for a rough ride. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you, Tim. Sarah, you're next, please.
Hi. Thank you, Tim, both for the talk and for the book. And congratulations on the book, too. It is expansive in scope and considerable in respect, I think, of the implications for the study of the discipline. And so I'm really appreciative, really, of the chance to have a chat about it and to hear more about it. And I think particularly the focus on the form of violence is really valuable, and it's a really useful counterpoint to that emphasis on discourse and ideology that is valuable, of course, but is really prevalent in the literature. And I'd like to just ask a little bit more about how that relates to the question of modernity. Because one of the things the book seems to suggest is that successful terrorism, so successful terrorism that is enacted, either seems to use the symbols and the material features of modernity against those who've inherited its legacy in terms of the power of the state. So violence is directed at mass transportation, as you describe, at national symbols. It's directed and performed on the urban stage, if you like. So it either uses those features of modernity or it evades them through lo-fi attacks that aren't networked, that are enacted by individuals who aren't using those systems. So if you take that idea about successful violence, the actual enactment of violence, either using those features of modernity or evading them, really I'd like to ask you what the implications are then for how the form of violence might emerge in the future. And also perhaps what further steps we might anticipate the state might take to prevent it. Now, I recognise that asking a historian about talking about the future is a bit of a provocation, particularly I think in your last chapter you described futurology as bunk. But despite that, I'd really be interested in your thoughts about how those dynamics might continue to play out, at least in the short term.
Thank you, Sarah, for those typically sharp questions, and you, as you've anticipated and breached my first line of defence. Yeah, the futurology is bunk was just a mischievous dig at Henry Ford, who I just quoted. You know, his famously said, "History is bunk," and then there's this wonderful quote from the 1920s about how the growth of cinema and radio is going to make the whole world one. We will all be wonderfully united. And I couldn't resist putting the quote in and then just having a dig at him for as historians always tend to be rather offended by his history as bunk. So it's hard to look forward in any detail. I mean, I think all I can do in a rather banal way is, try to read off the continued momentum of trends that are clearly ongoing and that have started in the past. I mean, I think your characterization is very astute and sharp, and I hadn't quite thought of it in those terms of the sort of the residual violence or the violence that evades modernity, and then the violence and tries to use it in its own, or use its own sort of semiotic code against it, if you like. I mean, I suppose, and I am thinking, what I'm going to serve you up are not deeply marinated thoughts, but half-baked ones. You're making me think on the spot. I mean, I'm struck by diffusion. It's remarkable. It's remarkable how much of the stuff we think of as terrorism is the urban stage or airports. It's airports and city centres. I mean, to an extraordinary degree, the concentration is absolutely amazing. And it, unfortunately, has sort of seemed to me as ripe potential for diffusion. You see, say, the Washington snipers was it 2003 or whatever? I mean, it wasn't really a terrorist thing, but and there were New York kind of serial murders in the 70s that were similar. So people who kind of roamed fairly unknown suburbs, spreading local fear, and really effectively. It does seem to me that the networking of the information age and the sort of do-it-yourself ideology that ISIS and others have pushed, and the sort of copycat mimetic nature of that, the sort of which, as sociologists have pointed out, the ice bucket challenge, who remembers that? But it came out of nowhere, it went nowhere. But I think vehicle ramming attacks are a bit like that, although they seem to now be creeping back up again. So I thought I wasn't, I thought I'd been quite careful, but I did make some predictions that are probably now going to be kind of exploded, and I'm going to be very foolish. But I think more of that stuff and a wider diffusion, stabbings in a Reading Park are quite different from, something outside the Houses of Parliament. I don't think the high-profile stage stuff will disappear entirely, but I think a sort of broader diffusion is something to fear, and I think you're seeing that in the emphasis of government trying to get the sector to step up and protect, after the Manchester attack, premises and entertainment premises. I mean, it's all before the pandemic, of course, but those kind of venues more assiduously. That does worry me, that's the obvious kind of growth of potential of horrors. And, I don't know what the likely defense against that is. I fear we will, maybe inevitable in the same way as each airport becomes a kind of police state, that we will have more and more, become more like Israel or whatever, which is rather dystopian vision. But as I say, those are my thoughts on the fly. But as ever, you have put me on the back foot. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. William, you're next, please.
Lovely. So I think in your book you want to talk more about kind of actions and less focused on ideas. So hopefully I'm going to change a little bit of that. Thank you very much for the talk. But the question I wanted to ask is, you talk about sort of the increasing marginalization of violence, that sort of the act of, I guess, public protest, riots, comes increasingly at the margins as sort of modernity kicks in and as states get more coercive. The question I wanted to ask is about the impact of democratization on that, and the fact that as states have become more coercive, they'd also become more democratic, especially in Britain, to give an example. You talk about how sort of by the 1930s, that sort of the British Union of Fascists were disowning sort of fascist, sort of street violence in Mile End. And this is the sort of interesting correlation between that and increasing votes for women, more sort of working class political representation. And indeed, I potentially argue, I want to see your thoughts on this, that actually sort of the growth of the state has been largely a sort of popular democratic growth, that rather sort of the growth of the state in opposition to its citizens, the state has sort of, it has grown alongside them with their support, and often sort of, the ever increasing expansion of the state is often quite popular publicly. And so I just sort of wanted to get a thought on how democracy as an idea has sort of changed how we practice democracy different, and the impact that's had on sort of the increasing coercion and growth of the state, and therefore the marginalization of violence. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, William, for those thoughtful, sharp comments. I suppose a sort of slight ragbag of responses. Yeah, I mean, the British Union of Fascists are to some extent idiosyncratic, because England is a weird country, as this university's most famous philosopher, John Stuart Mill, said. Ireland's not a strange country, but England is. How many other countries do you know in the world that last had a civil war in 1650? So the sort of sheer depth of stability that the English tend to take for granted is, tends to be a little bit unusual. But I agree. It did. Part of the reason I put that in was that the window breaking of Jewish premises in the East End was something even the British Union of Fascists kind of felt like, at least rhetorically, they had to condemn. I mean, there is a kind of good literature on Oswald Mosley, bringing in his henchmen and lieutenants to bollock them, and then with a sort of nod and a wink, letting them go. It's kind of like Trump and the Proud Boys. He'll condemn them, but we all know he's giving his apostolic blessing. So it's ambiguous. But no, that is a good example. I mean, I think I would, maybe I'm being unfair to you, but I think I would. I'd be a little more skeptical of this story of the driver, at least, behind the state expanding its powers and this happening with democratic support. I mean, sort of my reading of a lot of 20th century is, well, the elites commit the masses to horrendous world wars, and to keep them on board at all, they then have to do something to make the war effort sustainable and promise a better world in the aftermath. As I say, and I'm not original in this, but welfare follows warfare. The totalitarian regimes and the Nazis were on that before the democracies were. In fact, it was the democracies that were lagging, and although they did catch up. So, I think there's various stages to it in terms of the growing reach of the state. But I think you are right that it's the strength of the state comes through penetrating society and being. It's not power exercised over society in a kind of despotic kind of way. It's through society and using society, and that's what gives its enormous resilience. I mean, at a slightly higher level of abstraction, going a bit further back to the sort of extensions of the franchise in the 19th century, what does strike me is that attacks on parliaments, 1605 accepted, but attacks on parliaments are actually pretty rare, whereas the kind of bombing attack on the Houses of Parliament by Irish Fenians, 1885, and indeed the French National Assembly is bombed, isn't it, in the 1890s. I think even the Reichstag, there are attempts that don't come to much in the late 19th century. But there's a point at which popular legislatures become genuinely more representative, and they then get targeted. So there is a sort of And that doesn't mean that those attacks have democratic support, but when the people themselves become important, then targeting the people and targeting the people's house and assembly becomes more attractive to radicals as a result. And that's why I talk about the democratization of assassination. That sort of killing of leaders that has kind of spread down the social scale. Also, I mean, and I owe this point to my old supervisor, Mark Mulholland at Oxford. He sort of made the point that, well, often people make the argument that it's kind of Paul Wilkinson point, really, that democracies see a lot more terrorism because they have these liberal freedoms and they don't clamp down hard enough. And clearly there's a lot in that. Totalitarian regimes tend to kind of snuff out armed campaigns of dissent pretty quickly. But in a longer term historical perspective, he made I thought, rather brilliant argument that if you got a welfare state, then all the misfits who in a rural peasant society would not have married, would not have bred, would not have had children, would not have survived properly, go on to sit in bedsits and live on welfare and bruise their grievances. I mean, I hasten to say, I think the welfare state is one of the best and most progressive institutions of the 20th century, so that may be a necessary price worth paying. But I thought it was an insight into the sort of deeper roots of why we see a particular type of violence in democratic societies.
Thank you. David, you're next.
Okay. Well, this is quite an interesting experience because I'm a former counterterrorism practitioner, and I've not read your book, and in actual fact, until I saw it on Twitter, I'd never heard of you. So those caveats aside, if you take a broad brush approach and you talk about the pre-modern society, they suppressed, if not destroyed, terrorist groups. I'm particularly thinking of the anarchist movement pre-World War I. And now modern societies, and I accept that is mainly in the Western industrial world, it's a policy of containment and lessen the dangerous violence. What I thought was interesting is you've missed the point, maybe I've misheard, but terrorism is always armed propaganda. And I like your point about preference until relatively recently for attacking airports and air travel. That actually lasted for the best part of 40 years and then stopped effectively. But now, unlike, if you like, the pre-1914 world, it's a target-rich environment because the people are not defended, but institutions are. There are the occasional attacks on American embassies, which are heavily fortified, and most of the people who attack them die. But I'm a bit of a pessimist because Jeff Jonas remarked now 10 years ago that in actual fact it's easier now than ever before to kill lots of people. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for your interest. Flattered that you should have discovered me through my book. Of course, we can debate what constitutes modern. I mean, I was pushing back the boundaries of modernity in a very conventional way to the late 18th century and the French Revolution as the sort of the beginnings of the Western modern world. But of course, one could argue over all those interpretations. Anarchists for World War I mean, they certainly ebb and flow. They are quite powerfully suppressed in certain countries, but not universally so. And I think it seems to me often missed that there's actually an upsurge of anarchist attacks just after World War I. I mean, the Wall Street bombing is the obvious one that people do know about, but there's a bombing in Milan that kills about 23 people in an attempted assassination that brings down a theatre. There's an anarchist shoots Clemenceau, the French premier, and there's a whole rash of anarchist violence in 1920 when, according to Rappaport's model, it should all be dying out. So I don't know that they've utterly crushed it and squashed it. In some ways, they had greater freedom of action. I think, police forces could be a lot stronger armed. But in other ways, the rules of engagement can be extraordinarily restrictive. And I mentioned the Sydney Street siege of 1911, where, the poor copper who basically was going to try and apprehend these two Latvian anarchists under the Metropolitan Police's rules of engagement actually had to go and knock on the front door, be shot in the chest before the rules of engagement allowed the state forces, the police, and then the Royal Scots Guards they brought in to fire back. You compare that with 2005 and the tragic shooting of the Brazilian engineer, during the height of concern over suicide bombings. And, one sees a much more permissive environment, arguably. So I think there are forces pushing in both directions, but I'm not, in some ways, the globalized world of the late 19th century, with its extraordinary mobility and open borders and capital and people moving around in huge volumes is in many ways quite like the sort of world of the 21st century, and it's the 20th century that seems weird and different in between in broad terms. In terms of pessimism, well, as I say, I'm afraid it's a horribly ambivalent ending. I'm not expecting the apocalypse. I'm not expecting civil war. I think compared to the American Civil War or the world wars of the 20th century, these are still very good times. But the sort of soporific quiet of the 1950s or that sort of period, we're not going back to that. There's clearly going to be a lot more of these kind of horrors. And so I don't know whether you would push back on that. I think that's too ambivalent, but I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, and do please email me as well.
Thanks much again. Sarah, you have another question.
Thank you. I don't want to sort of monopolise if there are other people who want to speak, but it was really an invitation for you to expand a little bit methodologically. So you will be pleased to know that your talk has coincided with a week in research methods where we and a goodly number of the people who are in this group, our master's students, are looking at documentary sources and archival research methods. So given the very, very expansive scope of the book and its ambition, could you just talk us through a little bit about how you curate your sources, how you navigate what is just potentially an enormous amount of material to develop such a elegant and coherent argument? And I'm sure I will learn, as will the students too.
Well, how's that an invitation to find enough rope to hang yourself? You have a sharp nose for a weak flank. I mean, my starting point was really years back to try and write a history of terrorism. And I didn't think this had been done particularly well with all, Rappaport's article is sort of wonderfully concise 10 pages that we all have to deal with and engage with. It's what I think of as a checkpoint article. If you travel that road, you've got to pass. So he deserves enormous credit for that. I just found in trying to present what the ancestor of what became the research project as a kind of history of terrorism, then everyone pushed back and, well, what do you mean by terrorism? Doesn't it change? And I just thought this, I think if I focus on actions, then, yeah, of course, there can be all kinds of selection biases, of course, but it seems a little less slippery than discourses and constructions. Not that those things aren't important, and I think, the fact that I don't really take the terrorism label, I talk about terroristic violence, I tip my hat to Alex Schmidt, but I really don't want to kind of be imprisoned by a definition and get into kind of discourses and framings, but it's certainly there implicitly, and I suppose I'd just make the point for those of you who are interested in framings, then I think it matters who's speaking. It's not just about being a wizard with words. And the reason why the state's version of events is taken so credibly by many people is because there's enormous coercive power behind it. So that was the kind of some of the questions that I struggled with. And in the end, I sort of fell into this bipartite structure of trying to give basically a first half, a sort of narrative history of the rise of the Western state, and then to kind of break it down thematically by technique. I'll be honest, it's kind of a Clifford Geertz anthropologist thick description. You just immerse yourself in the detail of places one knows somewhere about and tried to read up about places I knew less about. So I did a lot of reading of French history and Italian history and so on. I was already stronger on the German history and the Irish history and so on and so forth. But it's uneven. It's undoubtedly uneven. It's undoubtedly impressionistic. And, it doesn't attempt to be comprehensive, and I've already begun to compile a file of all the kind of good examples that I missed of various examples or perhaps techniques I should have looked at and didn't. Violence against the self, hunger striking. I don't think we have a good history of hunger striking. So techniques seem to me seem to be easier to trace genealogies, but it's impressionistic and undoubtedly I've missed a lot And the short and glib answer is this is why it's 10 years after the last book. You know, there's been a lot of, I mean, as I say to my students often, you know, it's a bit like kind of having friends over for some sort of stir fry on a Saturday night, and you have a couple too many glasses of wine and you chop up too much veg and it won't all fit in the wok. You know, I mean, I've got tons of notes and books that will never find it into Killing Strangers, but you need to read that amount to be able to distill it down into this quantitative examples, whilst always being aware that I've missed stuff, and yes, it will be skewed, and it is skewed. It's much more about Western Europe, you know, Eastern Europe and Central Europe come and go in a bit out of focus. I know Steve's on the line, but you know, Canada isn't in the sharp focus as it could be. So I mean, there's all kinds of areas and weak flanks you could attack, but it was the best I could do with the knowledge base I had in the time I had.
There we are. So that's the message for pragmatism, and I think we'd all take that. So thank you.
It's definitely the much shorter version would have been a message for pragmatism. Yeah. And in a sense, Sarah, just as a kind of, I've often thought I tend to get into something, mine it hard, and then move on. And if I've sort of blasted open a route for others to move down and then tell me where I'm wrong, and then, you know, I hope I would be a generous enough scholar to say, okay, well, yeah, we're here to start debates, and if others disagree with us and prove us wrong, that's progress.
Definitely. Thanks, Tim.
Very good. I think that's a takeaway message for our students, especially in PhDs. The best ideas will come to your head after you publish your PhD, but there needs to be an end to it. And if you have enough information to answer your question, that's plenty. There's always a scope for a second book, isn't there, Tim? Are there any further questions, please? Now is your final chance to ask one. Raise your hand. While people are thinking, let me go back, since I'm already talking, to the original point of Omeni. When is a stranger actually a stranger? And I think you remember, Tim, a presentation we had last year or 2 years ago already, I forgot, about the political murder of Joe Cox, a member of parliament, basically, which was treated as a hate crime, with the argument that the perpetrator actually knew her and had a personal problem with her. Hence, because it was personal, it was not terrorism, it was a hate crime. And I didn't like that very much, because then I could say that the Red Army faction assassinations of Hans Martin, and of Hans Martin is a bad example, of the chief of the Deutsche Bank, for example, they hated him personally, but it was meant as an act of terrorism because it was meant to send a message. So sometimes that makes me think that we can use that, basically this distinction between hate crime and terrorism, as a kind of wiggle room. If somebody of us does it in group, so to speak, oh, it's a hate crime, it's not so bad. If somebody of them is doing that, it's terrorism. And here basically this idea of who is a stranger and who is not actually bleeds into legal niceties and details, in my opinion. But just as a comment.
No, I think you're right, Peter. It does have real-world consequences, and to a certain extent, I mean, going back to Sarah's comment on methodology, I mean, I suppose I work as a historian, but someone who's read a lot of sociology. And, you know, to a certain extent, one is dealing with ideal types. You know, for those of you who haven't sort of had, you know, crash courses in Max Weber or whatever, but, you know, an ideal type is a sort of exaggeration of reality against which to measure reality. The example that I use is, you know, if you know what a Toblerone looks like, and the picture on the Toblerone bar of the Matterhorn, you know, no mountain is a perfect triangle, but some mountains are closer to perfect triangles than others. You know, so to a certain extent, talking about Killing Strangers, you know, it is an ideal type. And you're right, one can find examples. I can think of Northern Irish parallels too, where, you know, through convenience, because, you know, just because you knew where someone lived or there was some family connection or something, you know, a victim is singled out, but the broader message is much more abstract and of what's trying to be communicated. So, you know, it doesn't always partition cleanly. I think, you know, if one looks at serial killers, stuff we don't tend to think of as political, but there, you know, there's there was one in attack in Norway, wasn't there? Again, a far right sort of hate crime, but I, like you, would want to think of it much more as terror, actually. But some right racist killed his half sister. Mm-hmm. I think she had an Asian father or something, and he killed her and then went on some rampage against a mosque or whatever it was. So there can be a nexus between sort of domestic in the home violence and then it's spilling out into something apparently much more abstract and representational. So, you know, the distinction I'm drawing is rather clean cut, and perhaps only works when you sort of stand right back and look at centuries. When you look at real world examples, it become more blurry, but I still think those outlines are at least worth exploring.
Okay, thank you much. Final chance for final questions. Tick tock. Well, yeah, Kurt.
Mute myself and unhide myself. Here we go. Thank you very much. And Tim, this is not a completely developed thought. We could continue this shortly later, but it follows on Kieran's question, which was about what constitutes a stranger and killing with strangers. The thought that occurred to me as you two were having your exchange is how terrifying killing, whether you consider it terrorism or not, can be either by design or by just instrumentally create strangers and atomize in such a way, either by design or through its instrumentation. And then you could see ISIS essentially drew on atomization to try to build a new society of their design. I'm navigating from the cases I know in the Balkans, where ethnic cleansing, this was often practiced by people who knew each other quite well, but often the paramilitaries from Serbia were people who did not know the people who they were terrorizing, Bijeljina, Drina Valley, what have you. But they created an atomized society where social trust was very hard to reknit, because you had people move from all over the place into new communities, and it created permanent results. So it's not a completed thought, but it just sort of followed on yours, and it might not even be germane to your topic, but I just wanted to throw that out there before it flew away.
No, thanks very much, Kurt. And I mean, expanding on my answer to Sarah a moment ago about pragmatism, I've long felt that we really lack good studies of the effects of terror campaigns. What effect do they have on societies? And I think that's probably a very heterogeneous phenomenon, or phenomena rather, that in different contexts. Bosnia is obviously a war. Other terrorist campaigns may have, we probably wouldn't classify as happening in the middle of wars. But the exception of Martha Crenshaw's work, and very old now, nearly 50 years old, on Algeria, there's not that much work on what one might call the terrorism that is successfully atomizing, where social cohesion really does seem to break down. Sort of Jerusalem, 1947-48, or perhaps Slavonia, Eastern Croatia, kind of 1991, bits of Bosnia, 1992. There's sort of moments where, as you say, violence actually is kind of social engineering, and that's dramatic. It can have enormously dramatic effects. I would make a plea. It's something that I kind of wanted to build into Killing Strangers, but just realized as I wrote feverishly against the clock as the sands of research leave ran out, that I wasn't going to get to it, and it was too much for this book. But that way in which we are very poor at we're obsessed with looking at how we get to terrorism, what situations lead to it, how individuals get involved, what then it does to whole societies. I think we're much less developed in our thinking about. And I would, I suppose, make a plea for taking atmosphere seriously. We leave atmosphere to the journalists and the poets, but if atmosphere is broadly understood as the intersubjective climate of expectations about what's going to happen next, within which all public business has to be conducted, then atmosphere clearly is politically important. And the divided societies that I know best, all of the journalism from Belfast in 1922, 1972, or 1992, at particularly tense moments, is you can cut the atmosphere with a knife. The streets are empty by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so on and so forth. And, similarly to Baghdad in 2003 or 4 or whatever, that stuff matters, and it matters for the kind of sum total of micro interactions upon which all society and economic activity depend. But I don't think we're very good at conceptualizing it or studying it. There are some exceptions, but broadly speaking.
Yeah, it can have an architectural quality in the atmosphere, as insolid as that word sounds. Yeah, thanks.
Roger.
All right, thank you much indeed. So we have actually now finished our session, nearly 1.5 hours. That went very well for a Teams meeting. No glitches. I don't want to jinx the next meeting, so I think. Tim, we worked you very hard. You've answered the question very well. I think you've survived this Viva with no corrections. So, and normally I would invite people now to join us for after talk drinks and then for dinner. That's still a possibility. Just I fear that everybody will go to his or her favorite pub or restaurant. That's the way it is nowadays. So again, thank you very much, Tim, for the presentation. Thank you very much for the audience for your interest and the questions we got. As regards the next talks, watch this space, i.e. Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Our new social media, so Connor Care will get it out to you. So sooner or later, you will get the information.
It will be Omani talking on Boko Haram. I'm looking forward to that, Omani. No pressure. But thank you for this session. Thank you for the lively questions. Thank you for the engagement with my book. It's weird to work on something in a long tunnel on your own and then finally serve it up. So, I deeply appreciate the close reading and curiosity and shown in it. Thank you.
Thanks,
all right. Speed up. Over and out, everyone. Cheers now.
Over and out.